Now, a month and a half ago, a very puzzling, surprising scene occurred in Argentina. For Americans, it was very disturbing. Or for many Americans, it was very disturbing. It was the World Social Forum. Leaders of the world had come together in Mar del Plata. Mar del Plata is like the Atlantic Beach or Atlantic City Beach of Argentina. I mean, in the summertime, thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people go there. So it wasn't held in Buenos Aires, it was held at Mar del Plata, and in that resort town, people came from all over the world to discuss the issues of countries with social problems, and every country has social problems, the most important one of which certainly is poverty. And to that conference came the President of the United States, George Bush Jr. During that conference, he was virtually a prisoner in his hotel. Every public appearance he made, this was Latin America, all right, Argentina, he was booed, hissed, booed. He retreated to his hotel, maybe to his bathroom, I don't know, for extra safety. The star of the event was a man whom George Bush Jr. and millions of Americans hate. His name is Hugo Chavez. He is the president of Venezuela. And he was the star. He just strutted out there into the public. He stood up on the stand, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people cheered him. And he denounced the United States of America. But not only that, he denounced globalization. Oh, that's the theme of this, of this series. He denounced it, and he received wild cheers from the audience. While he was there, he talked to a variety of people. His friend, the newly elected president of Uruguay, Vasquez, Lula da Silva, the president of the mighty nation of Brazil. So he had all his friends, and he talked, and he was acclaimed. And the Norte Americanos, I mean, they were beside themselves, the North Americans. Times are a-changing. There was a time when the United States of America arrived at a meeting of the rulers of Latin America, and everybody was very obedient and very compliant. It was very clear that the United States of America controlled Latin America, but not in this case, and it's been a very disturbing sign because the opposition was expressed not only to the United States of America, but to something with which the United States of America is associated. It's called globalization. What's wrong with globalization? Globalization simply means the free flow of goods and people around the world. How could that be wrong? If you're an arch-liberal, if you're a leftist, you believed in what we call internationalism. So what could be wrong? Well, the villain, as articulated at Mar del Plata and in other places in Latin America, the villain is what is regarded as the present agent of globalization, the people who are in charge of the globalization process. The evil name in the propaganda of the people who now hate globalization is the international corporation. What's wrong with the international corporation? Well, we'll tell you. The international corporation comes into a country. It can be Bolivia, it can be Peru, it can be Brazil, it can be Argentina. It invests. It goes to the place it goes to because it finds cheap cheap labor. It pays labor virtually nothing, and it takes its profits out of the country. Does not spend it in the country. So what you have certainly are people who may be working or who may have jobs they didn't have before. But the benefits of the talents and resources of the nation are taken out of the country. So resources are exploited, labor is exploited. So if the international corporations are in charge of the globalization process, that means that what you have in the world, according to the critique of Chavez of Venezuela, is that you have this incredible dichotomy. The small number of people in the world who own the stock in and control the international corporations, who reap enormous profits from the cheap labor and from all these wonderful resources, oil, natural gas, whatever else it is, in these countries, whose standard of living rises and rises and rises and rises, and the overwhelming numbers of people who remain virtually in poverty, working very hard to provide these benefits to those who are on the top. And do you hear the critique? All right, I mean, that's, so it's not opposition to globalization. It's opposition to the way globalization has developed. So what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is fairly clear. The alternative is called the patriotic corporation. A patriotic corporation is the state. It is a corporation owned by the government. It is the oil or the petroleum that you have in Mexico or that you have in Venezuela. If the government wants, it can take over the resource. It can take over the corporation. It can found its own corporation. And it can then decide how to redistribute the wealth, the profits. Chavez in Venezuela has taken $70 billion from the profits of the oil company in Venezuela and distributed it among the poor in Venezuela, making him one of the most popular presidents in Venezuelan history. Is he part of the global economy? Yes. He's selling his what? He's selling his oil all over the world. In fact, the U.S. economy could not survive without Venezuelan oil. Can the oil, the national oil company of Mexico or Venezuela or Brazil, Brazil's is called Petrobras, can they in turn invest in other countries? Yes, why not? Can the state corporations of China invest in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Peru? Can they? Yes. Just like private international corporations can invest. And then they can decide what they will do with their profits. Is the globalization process better when it's run by private international corporations, or is it better when it's run by national patriotic corporations? Got the argument? The argument isn't globalization because everybody's in favor of what? Selling their stuff anywhere in the world. Why not? The question is the distribution of rewards. So there is an alternative. And that becomes the argument. And in fact, the leaders of the alternative are mainly to be found in Latin America. A very disturbing thing for the United States of America, because they thought if they controlled any place, they controlled Latin America. In order to help you understand the evolution of this phenomenon, that is, Latin America becoming the center of an alternative solution to the globalization question. So let me talk about Latin America. Latin America includes not simply South America. I mean, most of Latin America is South America. But it also includes a piece of North America that extends from the United States border all the way down to Panama to Colombia. Millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, North America connected to South America, and so there is this land bridge. And that area is also part of Latin America. And also part of Latin America are important islands in the Caribbean. Right? Cuba, that's Latin America. The Dominican Republic, that's Latin America. So what we have is a vaster or larger area than South America. Now, Latin America can be divided up into various regions. There is what we call, I call it the Mexican region. That includes Mexico and its extension, Central America. There is the Caribbean region, which includes the islands of the Caribbean, but also the countries that face the Caribbean, like Venezuela. There is what we call the Andes countries. There is a range of mountains on the western side of South America that are very, very high and have actually featured some of the most interesting civilizations in the history of the world. We can call them the Andean nations. They are Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. There are the nations that are built around what I call the riverine system. There's a great river that ultimately flows out into the Atlantic. At the very mouth, it's called the Rio de la Plata. It's where Buenos Aires is. But there are dozens of rivers that are like tributaries that drain a fairly vast plain, which includes Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. They're all part of that area. Then there is the great Amazon area, basically a vast plain that at one time was just filled with rainforests, not many of them cut down. So this Amazonian system, which is the whole center of South America, that's another region. That's most of Brazil. And then there's the coastal region. The coastal region are the mountains that come along the Atlantic. Into this area, there have poured, or there have come, three races. And they define the character and the problem of Latin America. Because if the races had cooperated, if economically they were equal, then the problem that Chavez and his friends are addressing would be different, or wouldn't be there. The first are the Amerindians. They arrived, they came from Asia, they came down through North America, they ultimately entered into South America. They're more numerous on the west coast because they came from the west than they are on the east coast, but they drifted into the Amazon basin and even to the east coast along the Atlantic. And along the way, They discovered agriculture, and after agriculture came wealth, and from wealth came cities, and from cities came civilization. And there are three very famous civilizations that are part of Latin America: the Aztec and the ones that preceded the Aztec in Mexico, the Mayan culture and civilization in eastern Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras, and the Inca civilization, which was centered primarily in Peru and Bolivia, and they were very, very impressive civilizations. Now, the second group of people to arrive I call the Iberians. I say Iberians because they included both the Spanish and the Portuguese. That's the Latin element of Latin America, and they arrived in the area and settled down. One of the first things they did was, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, they killed off through disease that they brought with them, for which the Amerindians had no immunity, 95% of the Amerindian population died. So what survives is descended from the 5% who happened to make it. And they came as conquerors. And they basically enslaved the people they conquered. They brought with them two things that were to define the culture of Latin America. They brought two languages, Spanish and Portuguese. Spanish in all the countries in Latin America except Brazil, which is the largest and most powerful, where the language is not Spanish, but where the language is Portuguese. And they also brought a powerful religion with them. That religion is called Roman Catholicism, and they brought missionaries. And in fact, wherever you travel in Latin America, you can see that the oldest buildings around are generally churches and cathedrals. So the power of religion, the church, was very, very great. And so the Spanish and Portuguese were the white ruling class dominating a conquered Amerindian class. And that became the setting for the economy of Latin America. The whites owned all the land. They owned all the property. They controlled almost all the wealth. And the Amerindians who had been there before ended up poor, degraded, and often enslaved. So that's got a very strong dichotomy. There is very little of a middle class here. Do you understand? Now, the third group of people were brought to Latin America involuntarily. They are Africans. They were brought as slaves, primarily to the East Coast. And as the Amerindians died out, they needed to be replaced. And the Africans were brought in large numbers. In some cases, in many neighborhoods and areas, certainly in Brazil, there were more Africans than there were whites. And they're not only in Brazil, they're to be found in Guyana. And not only in Guyana, along the whole Caribbean coast, in Venezuela and Colombia. And they're certainly all over the Caribbean islands. Anybody who takes a cruise can see that. And they also came to the east coast of Central America. So the African presence is very strong in Latin America. And they occupied a position, in many cases, even lower than that of the Indian, because overwhelmingly they were enslaved. So you now have a white aristocracy of people of Spanish and Portuguese descent ruling two races who receive very few of the rewards Now, the economy isn't very well managed by the Spanish or Portuguese. They're not able to do what the English and the Dutch did with their economies. But whatever rewards there is a very unequal distribution of the rewards. Well, you say, they were fantastic managers. They deserve, what they got. They weren't such fantastic managers. They just inherited generation after generation. The power that they had, most of the work, the agricultural work, was done by the Amerindians and by the Africans. You have to see the setting. The setting in North America is different, except in certain areas of the South. We ended up with an overwhelming European population. And in fact, the Amerindian population was killed off. The only thing that saved them are casinos. I've said that before. Since casinos, we have 2 to 3 times as many Indians as we had before. Because that gives you a right to what? Open a casino. All right, fine. Now, and the African Americans, they constitute somewhere around, what, 11% of the population. That isn't 70% of the population. That isn't 80% of the population. So it's an entirely different kind of setting. Now, into this place came the British. At the end of the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century, the British had become the most powerful nation in the world. They created an empire which controlled not only land, but also the seas, and they had an economy. They were the beginners of what we would call the Industrial Revolution. So they had all these manufactured goods that they wanted to sell everywhere, and their ships could take it anywhere, and their guns could gun down, most likely, any fortress that they would encounter. Their great victory was the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. And after that, it was clear sailing. It was during the war with Napoleon that the British encouraged all the Spanish and Portuguese colonies to rebel against the mother country. The reason was very clear. They wanted to control them. So in the early part of the 19th century, all the colonies, with the exception of Cuba, became independent. And now the British came. This is globalization. I mean, the British are the inventors of globalization. They had all these manufactured goods, and they wanted to sell them everywhere. One way they could sell was obviously to conquer a country like India, then sell them shirts. I mean, the other was basically to invest in countries where there were resources they could use, take those resources out, utilize very cheap labor, and then bring in manufactured goods to sell to the people. So the presence of the British in Latin America is overwhelming. All these independent countries fell under the control of the British. They built the railroads. They built the ports. They established the banks. So if you wanted money, do you understand? It was British money. Did the economies improve? Yes, the economies improved. Was there some growth of the middle class? Yes, there was some growth of the middle class. But on the whole, the economies were controlled by the British. The most prestigious club in Buenos Aires until Perón was the Jockey Club. Argentines need not apply. It was a club for the English. And everywhere they went, that was their policy. And in fact, we always say, oh, President Monroe with the Monroe Doctrine, he kept all those Europeans out of Latin America. He said, you come back here and we're going to give it. Yeah, right. In 1823, the United States of America had the power to keep Europeans out. No, it wasn't the Monroe Doctrine. It was the British. The British said, you try to come in here. You try to take these countries back, the whole thing. We'll send you the British Navy. You'll be finished. So the economy was developed. So now you're getting globalization, aren't you? You're getting foreigners are now what? Coming into a place, they're selling their goods, they're extracting their resources, the whole thing. They're creating jobs. This is the beginning of the globalization process. But obviously, the overwhelming majority of the rewards leave the area and head for one of our favorite tourist destinations, London. That's why they have all those gorgeous buildings. I mean, certainly before World War II there were more, but I mean, all those gorgeous buildings there. Then came another influx. Many of these countries were terrified because of the imbalance between whites and Amerindians and blacks, that the lower classes would rebel. And so they decided that the only way to prevent it was to bring more white people to Latin America. So it was at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century that large numbers of Italians and Germans primarily, Italians and Germans were encouraged to move. Since they were white, they had great opportunities, right? So they now come in. So in Brazil, which was basically an African country, they pour in. And pretty soon, most of southern Brazil is white. Northern Brazil is black. They pour into Argentina. There used to be a black population in Argentina. You can't even find it. Argentina is now what? It's a white country. So they poured in. The Germans came to Bolivia. And in fact, they became the leading families in Bolivia. They came to Paraguay. The Italians ended up in Uruguay. I mean, they're all over the place. Everywhere you go. They're not Spanish, they're not Portuguese. They're Italians and they're Germans, and they came and they were white, and they enhanced the size, do you understand, of the ruling class. It made it more stable. So now there's a growing middle class. You go to Sao Paulo, and there are all these Italians, and they're all what? They're now middle class. They even brought Japanese. You go to Sao Paulo, you go to Brazil, there's a huge what? Japanese population. All of this was part of what we call whitening the population. The Japanese were honorary whites. But it was to whiten up the place. And in fact, they succeeded. They brought them to Venezuela. They brought them to Colombia. They brought them to Peru. They're all over the place. You go to Chile. There are all these people with German and Italian last names. They even brought the Welsh. They're shepherds down here in southern Argentina. So they did what the United States of America did to whiten the country. They brought in all these Europeans. And the whites who arrived entered what we would call the ruling class, right? They rose to the top. There were no discriminatory actions against them. So now there's a larger white population which stabilizes white control. I mean, there are certain areas where the whites are very thin. Bolivia, they can't breathe. I mean, it's high up. Peru is more vulnerable. Now, the next group of people to arrive are the Americans. The British Empire is in decline by the end of the 19th century, and the Americans, who are the daughter of the British Empire. We are an extension of English culture. We are. That's what I'm speaking to you right now. We are an extension. So the United States of America now replaces Great Britain as the major power. And in fact, the United States of America is a burgeoning country filled with the enterprise of the Industrial Revolution. They have millions and millions of products to sell, not only to Americans, but also to foreigners. And they also need resources, metals, minerals, whatever. Well, Latin America is a what? It's a perfect place. So now, as British power declines, American power grows. And in fact, the Americans sort of replace the British as the primary force, foreign force in Latin America. They invest their money. They may be growing sugar or bananas, or they may be building a railroad, or they may be building a port, or they may be building a factory. And in fact, North American investment becomes fairly considerable. So, and the Americans simply repeat the pattern of the British. From the North American point of view, and I keep saying American, but when you say Latin America, it's a very sensitive issue. They're also what? Americans. They're no, I mean, there's North America, South America. They call us, you know, the Norte Americanos, the North Americans. Well, the North Americans, I mean, their attitude was, I mean, these people were giving them jobs. They ought to be what? Grateful. Their attitude was, we worked very hard, and this was our land and our resources, and the levels of reward are minimal. So ultimately, there was a rebellion against this form of globalization. Globalization isn't new. Globalization has been going on ever since the what? The development of capitalism. I mean, you know, you manufacture goods and you go out and you sell them, and then people move, goods move, the whole thing. That isn't just the last 30 years. So the issues, there arose a series of issues that became provocations in Latin America. One of the issues, of course, was that the major owners of the resources and the manufacturing establishments were foreigners. In some areas that was less true than others, but certainly that was what? That was one of the foreigners are owning it. Now, obviously, in the case of globalization, you shouldn't care. If we in Detroit end up being owned entirely by Chinese, Japanese, and German people, we should say, well, it's all right, you know, it's the global world. But I must say, it takes a while for people emotionally to adjust to the global world. I mean, these are foreigners, and they've come in. And what aggravates it is they are taking most of the reward. And it's not just. That is, given the efforts and talents that are put into the manufacture of the project or the product, it's not just. That's the argument. And so that became a major issue. So now you wish to expel the foreigners. The foreigners in this case are, we don't even think of ourselves as foreigners, the foreigners in this case are the Norte Americanos. 60 years before, it would have been the British. Now, the beginnings of the rebellion are to be found in a few places. One of them is Mexico. There was a man played by Paul Muni called Juarez. You may remember him. He was an Amerindian. And he actually organized a rebellion against the people in control. His rebellion was encouraged by the fact that the French, under Napoleon III, had invaded Mexico to take control of it and its resources. And in the end, there was this rebellion, but the rebellion never succeeded. Juarez died, and he was followed by a man called Diaz, and Diaz simply made up with the Norte Americanos. The sign of it was that when oil was discovered in Mexico, he allowed them to take it over. That was it. That was the deal. Now, the first major rebellion, however, against the North Americans came in Mexico. It happened in the teens of the 20th century. There was a ruler of Mexico. You might call him the dictator. He was simply the president forever. His name was Porfirio Diaz. He was the president from 1871 until 1910. And in fact, during his time, the Mexican economy improved. There was large foreign investment, large amounts of American investment. One of the things that the North Americans were very excited about at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was the discovery in Mexico of petroleum. And in fact, the Americans, the North Americans, owned and controlled it. And the rewards from it were taken from Mexico to New York or wherever they were. Some of it obviously was left in Mexico. They needed Mexican labor, obviously. They provided some jobs. But there was enormous resentment because the poverty in Mexico. And Mexico had this huge Indian and mestizo population. The resentment was incredible. So starting in 1911, it would last until 1929, 18 years. Mexico fell into chaos. And in fact, there were all these people who arose who said they were the champions of the poor. There was Pancho Villa, there was the famous Zapata, all of these people. Were they sincere? Were they without corruption? That's irrelevant. The people were mobilized in a revolution. Ultimately, the chaos was resolved. A stable revolutionary government was established by 1930 and 31. And one of the people who became the leader of this stable revolutionary government, much hated by the United States of America, was a man by the name of Cardenas, and he nationalized the oil. It was during the Roosevelt administration, and it was not viewed as a friendly act by the United States of America. The hostility between Mexico and the United States of America was very intense, and it was reinforced, obviously, by propaganda. The American hostility to the Mexicans, and in Mexico, the hostility to the gringos. I mean, there was. But it was a revolution that succeeded. The Mexican government took over the corporation. They still have it. Now, is a government-run corporation incapable of dealing with a global economy? No. a government corporation can sell its what? Its oil to any customer. And that government, if it's not corrupt, can distribute more of the profit, if it wants to the people who live in the country, if it's corrupt. I mean, we got Saudi Arabia. I mean, okay. Now, the second example was in the 1930s in Brazil. The Brazilian economy, despite the influx of Europeans, was adversely affected by the Depression. The economy was not based on the production of industrial goods. It was based on the production of what we call primary resources. There was rubber, remember, in the Amazon, and there was coffee down near Sao Paulo, and in fact the market it collapsed in the early 1930s, and there was intense poverty. So now a hero arose. His name was Getulio Vargas. And I remember that name from my childhood because he was in the news. And he said, we must protect ourselves against exploitation. He then proceeded to nationalize many of the resources of Brazil. He began to invest it in industrialization, creating state corporations for manufacturing. He functioned pretty much as a dictator. He found the support of the military, and he was, for a while, wildly loved by the masses, and he used anti-American propaganda all the time. Did that mean that he didn't wish to participate in the global economy? No. His theme was nationalistic. Brazil for the what? For the Brazilians. We own our resources. We deserve the major rewards. Ultimately, his regime became extremely corrupt. See, corruption is the danger always in size. Now, people generally say corruption only happens in big government. It does happen in big government. In the end, the distribution isn't so wonderful. But it also happens in big corporations. We know that. Kenneth Lay can give all the speeches he wants to in Houston. I mean, in the end, that Enron thing stinks, right? It's a function of size. And so there was a lot of corruption. Ultimately, the Brazilian Revolution helped to industrialize parts of Brazil, but it was not lasting. The third one was Argentina, where they hated the British. You can't imagine how the English behaved for generations. Some English people were in Argentina for 3 generations and had not learned one word of Spanish. They were in the jockey club. Why would they have to learn Spanish? You. Got it? Why do you know the not very different from our attitudes frequently. Okay, and they owned the banks, the whole thing. So now there arose a faction in the Argentine military that said we're going to liberate our country from this control. One of the military officers who in the end proved to be successful has been in a musical frequently as a result of Andrew Lloyd Webber's incredible effort. It's my favorite musical, I must tell you. Evita is my favorite musical. So his name is Juan Perón. What did Juan Perón promise? What was his movement? His movement was kick out the foreigners. Let the profits come to what? To Argentina. So, he then proceeded to nationalize everything, including the banks. And the British now in the Jockey Club are... The crowd, by the way, that made nice to those British, you saw them on the stage in Evita, they're that little circle of, remember aristocrats? They dance around the stage. Meanwhile, Perón and his wife, Evita, they're giving it to them. And now he takes thousands and thousands of workers off the farms. He brings them to Buenos Aires. He builds factories. He gives them jobs. He cooperates with the unions. He gives them welfare. And they love him. There are people in Argentina that still love him and love his wife. And one of the reasons there was sympathy for Germany was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of the British was Germany. So, and the Peronists came in and the whole thing, and there was a great change. And the people seemed to be happy, but the levels of mismanagement and corruption were overwhelming. By 1955, it was all over. He had to flee. But the Perón Revolution is part of this. Everybody I grew up with, he was a fascist. Well, yeah. The point was, he was supported by the labor unions. And then there was Peru. Back in the 1920s, I mean, Peru's the worst because you've got all those Inca, India, the Quechua. I mean, they're dirt poor, nobody cares anything about them. And then the rich whites are in Lima. So now there arises a party led by whites. It's always white intellectuals that do the what? The thing. The children of the middle class become discontent with their parents' behavior. Then they go out, become intellectuals, and then they organize the masses with whom they have no racial or cultural connection. Okay, fine. So now they organize a new party. It's called APRA, and APRA is a party. We are going to redistribute. The main cry is always, kick out the foreigners. Mao Zedong said that. Kick out the foreigners. What's wrong with globalization, if you want to, is that the rewards go mainly to the foreigners. APRA, by the way, it was very clear that they sustained a majority vote of the people of Peru. But year after year, they were denied victory in elections, both by the upper class and by the army. But in the 1960s, something interesting happened. A military leader by the name of Velasco took over, and he wasn't on the right, he was on the left. And he was the one who began the process of nationalizing. He nationalized the oil. There wasn't that much oil in Peru, but there was some oil in Peru. He nationalized the petroleum. And so there was the beginning of that, but then the levels of corruption were important. In 1985, Garcia, who was the leader of APRA, it's the first time in 60 years that APRA was able to take the government with the permission of the people in charge. He turned out to be one of the most corrupt presidents in the history of Peru. In fact, he was the introduction to a man who liked the Americans, a Japanese Peruvian by the name of Fuji, do you remember him? Fujimori, all right, fine. Now, Bolivia, going all the way back to the 1940s, what did Bolivia have? Tin. And the tin miners were paid what? Virtually nothing. So now a party arises in the 1940s led by whites, white intellectuals, and some of the military, and now they propose to nationalize the tin mines. Okay, fine, good. Out with the foreigners, but in the end, the levels of corruption are so great that nothing happens for the poor. So I mention these things because you see all this action going on in Latin America? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there's America. The whole thing is aggravated after World War II by the arrival of the great enemy of America, called the Soviet Union, and the philosophy it represents, namely communism. So now the big theme of American foreign policy is anti-communism. So anti-communism means that anybody who is trying to redistribute wealth in Latin America must be a what? Must be a communist. And so, and that was aggravated by the demonstrations in 1948 when the American states met in Bogota, the rioting and whatever. The Americans became very scared. By 1954, a man comes to power in Guatemala who isn't a communist. His name is Arbenz. But he is on the left, and therefore he is accused of being a communist. So the American government, they overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala. And then in Brazil, Vargas sort of goes out of the way. He's followed by a Polish man by the name of Kubitschek, who becomes by the way, the white population in Latin America is not just Spanish and Portuguese. All these other people of what? Now, they've immigrated there. So Kubitschek now becomes the president, and he sort of stimulates the economy, but he's ultimately succeeded by a leftist by the name of Goulart. And in fact, the American government doesn't like the sound of his hostility to foreign control. He ultimately will be overthrown by the army, and there will be an army dictatorship with which the American government will cooperate for 20 years in Brazil, from 1964 until 1985. Well, and then in Colombia, where there are also there are large numbers of mestizos in Colombia, and there's an African population in Colombia, and the dichotomies between the whites and the others was fairly great. And now rebellion breaks out in Colombia, and the United States of America now intervenes by supporting the Colombian governments, whether they're called liberal or conservative, that will fight the rebels. The one thing, the piece of good news for America is, by the 1950s, the candidates for the presidency of the Revolutionary Party of Mexico have already gone to Harvard and Yale and Wharton. So, although it's called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, it doesn't make any difference. The Mexican government now turns pro-American. They're interested in developing what we would call an economy friendly to the United States of America. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, despite riots from time to time, the Mexican government, which was very hostile to the United States of America, now improves its relations. That was one piece of good news. But then, and this is the foundation of Chavez, then come what I call the Big Four. And the Big Four have occupied a great deal of North American attention. In the end of 1958, there was a country, an island called Cuba, under the control of a man called Batista, in which there was a growing middle class, mainly in Havana, and there were certainly prosperous investors, And there was a vast population, largely African or mulatto, in Cuba, living at levels, we can call it BP, below poverty. And a man, and again, a white man, it's interesting, by the name of Fidel Castro. Remember him, because when we talk about Chavez, the story will now change, all right? This is the typical story. The children of the whites now organize the blacks and the mestizos and whatever they are. That used to be true in America. The NAACP was organized by whom? Whites. And then they were told to leave. Then there was the rebellion that was part of what we call consciousness raising. There was the rebellion in the 1960s, or at the end of the 1960s with regard to that. His name is Fidel Castro. He now organizes this rebellion. He is victorious. He is popular for about 1 month in the United States of America. And then he proceeds, that's what he does, to nationalize everything. The plantations, the factories, whatever it is now nationalized. Does that mean he's opposed to international trade, that he doesn't want to sell his sugar? No. He believes in global trade. But he now believes in what he calls patriotic corporations. And so he, by this act, he totally discombobulates the Americans, and because they now become angry and want to overthrow him, he turns to the Soviet Union for help, and out of it comes an alliance with the Soviet Union, which helps to preserve him. Cuba still remains what? This provocation. I was just there, by the way, for the second time, and I will discuss it in the near future. This is a country under siege forever. There are millions and millions and millions of Americans who regard the Cuban government as ultimate evil. The point is, it has survived. And in the heyday of Cuban communism, it had an ambition. Castro did not see himself merely as the leader of Cuba. What's the leader of Cuba? Like being the mayor of Southgate. No, what? Nothing. He saw himself as the revolutionary leader of Latin America. And associated with him was an Argentinian, a doctor by the name of Che Guevara. You will see his picture. I want to tell you, Mar del Plata, when Chavez spoke, his picture was on the left, on the right, in front. He became a hero for this movement because he died young. I want to tell you, had he survived and gotten old? Never. But he died young, and there is this picture of the young Of the young Che Guevara who died in Bolivia trying to overthrow the government there. So, Cuba, still unresolved, right? We thought in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, it would go.
So, Mom, what if something happens? Should I stay where I am and wait for you, or go to Grandma's house since it's closer?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of a terrorist attack.
Is there a place we all meet? If the phone doesn't work, how will I tell you I'm there?
And one extremely good reason why you should.
What should I do?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency. For more information, go to www.ready.gov.
But the Cubans found European investors. And now they're getting their oil at low prices from Mr. Chavez of Venezuela. Ooh. So it's like a provocation. I mean, it's not far. I mean, if you spend the winter in Miami or near it, I mean, do you understand? It's only a few miles. All right. The second provocation, which occurred in the early 1970s, was in Chile. Chile was a country which had a fairly large white population. It's certainly almost half the population in Chile is white, but there also is a mestizo population. And in fact, there was inequity, and there was a man called Allende. Remember him? So, although Chile had been stable for a long time, Allende liked Castro, and in fact, Allende now organizes a campaign to win the presidency of Chile, and he does. He becomes the president of Chile, and once there, he then provocatively begins to nationalize everything. Not only that, he wants to create collective farms, so he allows squatters. He allows people to go and squat on other people's farms and whatever else. I mean, the whole thing. Unendurable to the United States of America. Did Allende not wish to sell his products around the world? Was he opposed to globalization? No. Was he opposed to investing the money of Chilean state corporations in other countries? No. He was opposed, obviously, to, this is the phrase, got it? The international corporations. So he takes over, and he's overthrown. He's overthrown by a man called Pinochet. Pinochet's the military man, and a reign of terror follows. And then, interestingly enough, and this is part of the argument, Pinochet, once he's removed or killed off his enemies, then proceeds to reform the economy. He likes Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. He thinks their idea of the market economy is exactly what Chile needs. So he dictatorially enforces it. And out of it comes a revived economy. I mean, I know they grow cherries up near Traverse City. Most of the cherries I eat come from Chile. I think a lot of the plums I eat, I don't know. I mean, you can't imagine what has happened. You go to the supermarket, I mean, wine, produce, I mean, whatever it be, I mean, coming from Chile. Now that is the result of Pinochet's reform of the economy. So now that introduced into Latin America a problem. Maybe it's not so bad if you have foreign investors coming into the, maybe international corporations aren't that bad. Look what's happened to our economy. Chile remains this problem. Had Allende fallen and Chile remained poor, but Allende fell and Chile became not rich, but it became what? Much, much more prosperous. So that's like it's a feather in the American cap, but it's like a in the cap of the rebels. So that's number two. The third, it happened in 1979. There's this little itsy-bitsy country. I mean, it's too small to be independent. Central America in 1823 was all united. And then it fell apart in 1838. And each of these little provinces became an independent country, and none of them is what? Big enough or rich enough to really function on its own. It's called Nicaragua, all right? And it had a dictator for a while called Somoza, who was supported for a while by the United States of America, since he claimed to hate communists. All you had to do was to say you what? You hated communists, and then you received support. So Somoza is overthrown. And after the fall of Somoza, all of a sudden, comes this force named after one of the rebels who was now dead against the establishment. The Sandinistas, remember the Sandinistas? Oh, yeah, the Sandinistas now. And now they take over the government, they win the presidency, and now they begin to nationalize, collectivize the whole thing. Are they opposed to global trade? No. In fact, right next door to them is the country called El Salvador. That also gets caught up in this whole business. We're not quite sure what to do. We give money to the Contras, who will what? Overthrow the Sandinistas. I mean, the thing going for America, and this is the other argument. Now, this is very interesting. Allende was overthrown, and Pinochet, this terrible, ruthless man, took over and produced an economy that worked following what I call the standard formula of the globalization process. Meanwhile, the Sandinistas take over in Nicaragua, and they follow the standard leftist program, and it what? We have to explore why. I mean, one of the reasons happens to be, obviously, the levels of corruption that exist, especially when national corporations are connected to the army. But the other reason is very simple. If you insist on confiscating the property and ownings of the international corporations, nobody will invest in your country. Got it? That is, you have now cut yourself off from any kind of foreign investment, whether benign or not benign. It doesn't make any difference. Well, the Nicaragua situation ultimately is resolved because the Sandinistas they're repudiated. Not simply by virtue of American intervention, it's also because they just totally produced a non-functioning economy. But then, and here's the star, the new leader. His name is Hugo Chavez. And if you look at him, he's different. Che Guevara, I mean, so white. Fidel Castro, I'm just a white man running, you know, I love India, thank you very much. I love black, thank you very, very much. White! Vargas, white! You look at Chavez, this is very important, the change is beginning now. His features are mestizo. I mean, there is Amerindian, do you understand? There's more Amerindian than there is white in that face. They don't have to use white intellectuals anymore. So now, Chavez, and he enters, how do you survive if you are poor and not white? You join the army. Doesn't that happen in America? No, I mean, no, how do you survive? You join the what? You join the army. So now he joined the army, and he rose up, and pretty soon he becomes a lower officer and whatever, and he's got moxie. Ooh. Guts. In fact, in the 1990s, early 1990s, he leads a rebellion against the Venezuelan government. Now, Venezuela is different from Nicaragua. Venezuela has the largest petroleum resources outside the Middle East. There it is. He who seizes the government will own the petroleum resources. So, he is defeated in the first attempt to take power. In fact, he's imprisoned and then released. They should have killed him, most likely, from the point of view of the opposition. I mean, they made a mistake, but he survives, and now he comes back, and he runs again, and he wins the election, and his message, and he's a good speaker. He has some of the Castro touch. Message is very clear. Kick out the foreigners, but not only kick out the foreigners, because by then Venezuelan oil was pretty much controlled by Venezuela. Look at this white ruling class in this country. They feed on the profits, and they will not share it with the poor. So I have a statement to make. The profits from the oil industry, this will be a patriotic corporation. The profits from the oil industry will be shared with the people of Venezuela. And I want to tell you, he has done that. Is he dictatorial? Yes. Is he sometimes naive? Yes. Is he a pain in? Yes. But his popularity has soared. The opposition tried twice to overthrow him, and they what? They failed. And the American government almost openly and brazenly supported the rebellions and the intervention. Chavez has taken over, and now he owns, controls all this oil, and he can decide what to do with the profits. Is Venezuela part of globalization? Of course it is. It has one of the most desirable products needed by the whole world, including the Chinese. And there is a state corporation prepared to what? To sell it to them and then to buy things. So now the issue is, how do you distribute the rewards of that? And his answer is, give a lot of it to the poor. Is some of it going to the military? Of course, he needs the military to support it. He's giving money to the poor. He's building schools and community centers and whatever else it is, and he's doing that. And now he sees himself as a successful Castro. What was Castro's problem? He's on a little island with sugar. Oh, please. What are you going to do? He is now in a country with huge petroleum reserves, and now he is going to be the leader of the revolution. He is going to change the globalization process. He is going to create patriotic corporations and not allow the international corporations to take over. So now, there he is. For the first time in Latin America, a leader with incredible resources needed by the United States of America is in charge of what is called the anti-globalization process. It's not anti-globalization, it's anti-international corporation. It wants to revise the scenario of the globalization process. So what's going to happen? If you'd like to find out, please come back in 5 minutes. Thank you. And now, let me simply mention that the globalization process obviously encourages free trade. That is, you want to sell your goods in another country. And the other country says to you, well, if you want to sell goods in our country easily, we'll lower our tariff barriers if you will what? Lower your tariff barriers. So one of the signs of globalization is that all over the world, in regions of the world, free trade emerges. Certainly the most dramatic one was the North American Free Trade Association, right, which was created during the during the Clinton, he should only have behaved like Lincoln. No. During the Clinton administration, and it was a very interesting and bold move. Creating a free trade area between the United States and Canada was not controversial. But including a Latin American country, it's in North America, but it's not generally viewed as what? As North American. Mexico, all right, it's the cross the border, it's Latin American, and for many Americans threatening because they see the increasing numbers of Hispanics in this country undermining the cultural integrity of the country, whatever. But Mexico was included. And in fact, NAFTA has been good for Mexico. It has stimulated trade. It's been good for the United States of America. Mexico is now the second most important country for international trade for the United States of America, which means the Mexicans can buy the products, right? Now, added recently was something very interesting. Chile. Chile was admitted into NAFTA because its relationship to the economy of North America is very intense. It does not feel threatened by this free trade relationship, and so there is Chile. Now, one of the ambitions of the American government, and now it's the Bush administration, is to create a free trade arrangement with all of North and South America. Work with Mexico, it'll stimulate the economy, it'll be good for the United States, it'll be good for the others, whatever. But they now have encountered, because of the historic fear of American control, they now have encountered, of course, resistance. During the time that NAFTA was being formulated, other regional unions were created. One of them was the Central American Caribbean unit, which isn't very powerful simply because these countries have very few things to to sell. I mean, it's not major. But one of the major ones, and it was clearly organized as a kind of response to the NAFTA thing, is Mercosur. Mercosur is a union of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, with Chile sort of cooperating. So Chile has its hands in Mercosur, and also it's part of NAFTA. Now, this includes the most dynamic economic entity in Latin America, and that is Brazil. And Brazil sees itself as the leader of this union. And the nations of Mercosur do not wish to become part of an American union. So for the Bush administration, this is a problem. Now, along the way, for the Americans, a series of surprises have occurred. So let me just go over the surprises. First of all, one of the things America decided to do that certainly is good for our culture is to fight drugs. Where do drugs come from? Well, there's heroin from Asia, but there's cocaine from Latin America, and any tourist can see the coca leaves in Bolivia. When you're up at the altitude and you can't, you're a little nauseous, they give you coca tea. I mean, what are you talking? They're the leaves floating around in the tea. So the major growing areas of coca is Bolivia and Peru and Colombia, all right? And then it's processed most likely in Colombia and shipped through Mexico up into the United States of America. So the United States said, we're going to help the world. We're going to destroy all the coca farms in Bolivia, in Peru, in Colombia, spray it, whatever. Well, it's turned out to be one of the most unpopular campaigns ever. Because the only way poor people can make a living is to grow coca leaves. So now they come in and they don't fly over the houses of the rich in Lima dropping bombs. They come over the farms of the poor, they spray and they kill the plants. The man who was just elected in Bolivia, Morales, as the president of Bolivia, and you look at his face, no white intellectual, this is a full-blooded Aymara Indian, Amerindian, all right? He was a coca farmer. He was furious. What are we supposed to do? So these rich people don't want their children taking drugs. So they get these planes and they send them down, and they take a living, they take our living away. On that campaign, he was elected the president of Bolivia, with pictures of Che Guevara behind him, this side, that side, the whole thing. The second surprise was the leftist government in Peru was overthrown. I mean, the corruption was overwhelming, and Garcia could not control guerrillas that were even more leftist, called the Shining Path. So overthrown, and followed by this Japanese Peruvian by the name of Fujimori, who tried to do what Pinochet tried to do. He was equally as authoritarian, but his dictatorial rule rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, so there was a rebellion. He actually ran a presidential campaign where he rigged the election, and then he was forced to flee. He just came back, by the way, from Japan. He landed in Chile hoping to get back to Peru, but they arrested him in Chile. They put him in jail. So will it work? Won't it work? I don't know. But that was a surprise because we thought of Fujimori as a stabilizing force. The problem is that the economy improved, but the improvement of the economy raised the expectation of the lower classes who were not getting anything. The third, of course, is the continued resistance in Colombia. We have been backing the Colombian government. We like the presidents of Colombia, this recent one, Uribe, who's trying to amend the Constitution so that he can be elected again as the president of Colombia, receives wide American support. But no matter what he does, he can't seem to defeat the rebels or the guerrillas, and that was a surprise. Then came Argentina. There was a president, he called himself a Peronist, by the name of Menem. And Menem then decides, with American advice, to peg the Argentine peso to the American dollar, rendering everything overwhelmingly expensive. So Argentine exports are now what? You can't even buy Argentine exports. Stupid. So the economy collapses. At the end of 2001, the whole economy collapses, and so Menem withdraws, and then there's a period of chaos, And then a man from Patagonia of German extraction, here's the name, Kirchner. That's not Spanish. All right. Kirchner now gets elected president, and he's a Peronist. He likes Evita, by the way. Who doesn't? No. So, I mean, she was the champion of the what? I mean, champion of the poor, a little corrupt, but champion of the poor. So he now becomes president, and he's got a very defiant tone. He says to all the people they owe money to, we're not paying any debts. Whatever money we make now, we invest in the economy, in the people. We're going to create jobs, and you're going to have to wait for your money. And the International Monetary Fund says, what? How? It's outrageous behavior. So send a fleet. Invade. Do something. Go on, whatever. And in fact, the economy has greatly improved since Kirchner took over. That is, he directed the rewards not to the international banks that were outside of Argentina. He directed whatever rewards there were to a reinvestment in the people themselves. And so Kirchner is wildly popular. And then we come to Brazil. Brazil, even under the military dictatorship, experienced an improvement in its economy. It now turned into a manufacturing nation. Before it was rubber, but then they didn't need Brazilian rubber. And then coffee, and coffee is very, like sugar, is very, very problematic, although you wouldn't know it from Starbucks. Anyway, they're going to stop calling it coffee. The Webster's Dictionary has decided to call it Starbucks. There's no point in calling it coffee. Okay, so anyway, so now Brazil begins the industrialization process. Now it has all kinds of products to sell. One of them are airplanes, the other are weapons. Major weapons sales, people, airplanes, whatever. And then they discover that in the interior there's this whole area south of the rainforest. So it's like a dry plateau, the Mato Grosso. And it's like big, vast, like the American prairies. They decide to grow soybeans and corn. And now Brazil has become one of the major competitors in agricultural products with the United States of America. So it's sailing economically. However, most of the rewards are still going to the white people who live in the South and not to the black people who live in the North. So there's a lot of unrest. And in fact, there's a man, his name was Lula da Silva. And he ran for president in 3 elections and didn't make it. He's a socialist. And does he believe in globalization? Yes. Does he believe in the globalization of the United States of America? No. So now he gets elected president. He still is a raving socialist. So there's Kirchner in Argentina. There's now Lula da Silva in Brazil. Well, one of the places we won is Mexico. Finally, Mexico repudiated the Institutional Revolutionary Party. They elected Vicente Fox, whatever. And he's now the president, and he likes, like Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and whatever, and now we're going to change the whole thing in Mexico. He's changed very little. He's proved to be an enormous disappointment. And his chief rival is not somebody from the former Institutional Revolutionary Party. It's a party for democracy, the leader of which is the leftist mayor of Mexico City, whose name is Obrador. And what is he saying? We've got to do more than simply have international corporations open up factories in Mexico. I mean, there are still in Mexico millions and millions and millions of people, mestizos, Indians, who are dirt poor. There's something about the distribution of things that needs to be attended to. So, he wants patriotic corporations. Well, there's a good chance that in the upcoming election next year, or the end of this year, no, in 2006, that Obrador, polls have indicated it, could defeat Fox. Police. Lula in Brazil, Kirchner in Argentina, and worse than that, and there's Chavez in Venezuela, and now you got Morales in Bolivia, and not only that, Chavez went down to Uruguay, and in Uruguay they elected a leftist president by the name of Vasquez who says the same thing. Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, and maybe Mexico. What's happening? And the worst surprise is that Castro has survived, and one of the reasons is he's got Chavez sending him oil. So what are the reality? Today, in what we call the emerging global economy of Latin America, the leftists are rising. Bizarre, is it not bizarre? Bizarre. Anti-Americanism is rising. The one thing that may be the good news for America is that once the leftists come to power, they moderate their position. So Lula in Brazil has disappointed many of his followers, and the reason is very clear. If you take the extreme position of Castro, then you cut yourself off from all foreign investment. You have to do a balancing act, do you understand, of what we call patriotic corporations and foreign. You got to do this thing, because if you are too extreme with patriotic corporations, you're not going to get any foreign investment. So he can't simply nationalize, redistribute. It's not going to work. So he's doing a pretty good act. Now, some of the people in his party are disappointed with him, and the left wing has seceded from his party and organized another party, but what's new? Okay, so the thing that is very interesting for the Americans is we always thought of ourselves as the investors. And then we sort of got used to the Europeans having money to invest. That's what happened in Cuba. Germans, the Dutch, the French, all right. They're white people. Well, I want to tell you, they're investing mightily in Latin America, but now I want to tell you about the investors. And they have patriotic corporations. Many of them are Chinese state corporations. Rich. The Asians have arrived in Latin America. The